It's the week everyone has been talking about for over a month. The drama of fresh earnings is upon us as Apple, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft all report earnings. While many of us have been trying to guess whether or not we are already in a recession, this week will make it clear. Even the White House is preparing for the bad news. They have already downplayed the impact of the definition, attempting to change the perspective despite the alarming trends. If the giants falter this week, the repercussions are going to be severe. By Friday, we will have a much better understanding of the overall state of the economy, with plenty of CEOs forced to speak out on disturbing trends we see emerging throughout the market. With inflation at a mind-boggling 9.1%, the dynamics of this market are creating a scary scenario. We know the numbers. All over the place, the market is flashing red, indicating that we're seeing a downtrend in consumer confidence. At the 6-month mark this year, the 60-40 portfolio, a golden standard in investing, had its worst performance in history. But despite this wild start to the year, it seems like stocks are holding on, failing to break a low that was set in early June. Everyone is now wondering, will this be a minor recession with a quick 20% dip, or the start of a major economic crisis that will change financial history forever? One man who has spent hours upon hours examining the stats to try to determine the short-term future is Bank of America's global head of economic research, Ethan Harris. He appeared on CNBC to share his summary, and it's an interesting perspective built upon a foundation of leading indicators fed to him by dozens of analysts and researchers that work underneath him. Take a listen to his analysis ahead of this critical week. But before I show you his comments, take a second to hit that subscribe and like button if you're enjoying the content thus far. Now back to the clip.
Isn't your call the firm's call that we're going to be in recession this year?
Yeah, I'm actually puzzled, to tell you the truth, why more people aren't forecasting recession. If you look at the consensus, people are expecting modest growth of 1% or so in the next 4 quarters, and we're looking for minus 1% or so in the next 4 quarters. The point I've been making is that we can't cure inflation in a painless manner. Some of this inflation will come down naturally as commodity prices stabilize and as supply chains improve. So that part of the inflation problem is fixable without a recession. The part that isn't fixable is the absolutely crazy red-hot labor market. The Fed has to see a major weakening of the labor market. Otherwise, we're going to get massive ongoing cost pressures with rising wages. There's no way the Fed can hit their 2% target for inflation in the next few years if they don't significantly cool off the labor market.
So Ethan says something there that is rarely discussed on TV. It's an unfortunate truth that is a byproduct of capitalism and central banking. You see, the Federal Reserve has this mandate to keep inflation at 2%. Now that this goal has spiraled out of control, they need to tame it with higher rates, and they have already started to do that. And of course, as a result, equities have taken a hit. Like I mentioned earlier, plenty of indicators are now pointing to bad times ahead, but this is kind of exactly what the Fed wants. Ethan has this great quote. He says, "We can't cure inflation in a painless manner," and what that translates to is that the Fed has to kill demand and ultimately cause job loss in order to prevent something called the wage price spiral. If you listen to his words, Ethan essentially says that there are 2 factors that influence price growth significantly: commodities and jobs, but it's the latter that gives inflation most of the fuel, and right now we have, by his own words, an absolutely crazy, red-hot labor market. Something the Fed would never admit is that they're looking to weaken the labor market before they consider cutting back on rate hikes. They will never reach that 2% inflation goal if unemployment is at record lows and there are more job postings than people looking for a job. So in summary, we're at this point where the data is suggesting a slowdown in the economy, but the effects of rate hikes haven't really flowed down to the labor markets. We're seeing the disturbance to housing and a few other areas of the economy, but ultimately the Fed has to finish its job, which is sadly to ruin the economy a bit more until we see a slowdown in the job market. Ethan does a much better job than me explaining this exact concept. Take a listen to his unique analysis.
So most people think, well, if we're going into recession, why do they need to keep hiking?
Well, I think that it hasn't happened yet. I mean, the data are weak. They're very uneven, right? I mean, you're looking to the data this week was kind of uniformly weak. Remember, the housing sector is kind of the point of the spear on monetary policy. When you hike rates, that's the sector that gets hit hardest and fastest. And so there we're seeing the effects of the Fed already. What we're not seeing yet is significant weakening of the jobs market. Now, as you pointed out, claims are inching up, but by historic standards, they're way below normal still. They should be up well into the 300s for the Fed to argue that they've gotten the labor market under control. So they need to kind of finish the job and keep hiking. If they were to back off now, I think you would see, the markets are pricing in those hikes. They're already embedded in the markets. It would be a remarkably surprising easing of financial conditions that's not at all warranted given the inflation outlook.
So now that we know this, many are wondering, why don't we just get it over with and use a Paul Volcker-like style where we jack up the rate by a crazy amount, shocking the economy, putting us into a recession, and fixing inflation in a short amount of time in order to ensure a prosperous decade for years to come. Well, that's not going to happen because the incentives are not there. Paul Volcker only happened after this country spent nearly 10 years battling high inflation and failing over and over again. If you recall, following 1969, we had years upon years where inflation was above 5%. You can see this clearly from this Fed chart. In 1970, inflation shot up to about 6%. This was followed up by a mild recession, which coincided with an attempt to start closing the budget deficits of the Vietnam War and the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. This in turn pushed down inflation back to normal levels before it once again shot up to 12% in 1974, and this is where we had the worst of the worst, a recession with inflation, also called stagflation. This period is usually blamed on the Nixon shock and the oil crises. From that point in 1974, inflation would not come down under 6% until 1982. It was almost 10 years of pain before finally Paul Volcker said we're done with it and decided to throw the haymaker, shocking the economy into a government-induced recession to end inflation once and for all. Many claim that we're not here. We are here at the start of a painful journey that will likely be fought with careful Fed measures. It's going to take a lot more pain before we can have the incentives to have a figure like Paul Volcker show up and make drastic changes. Ethan explains this in this final clip.
They have to risk a recession. There's no other way to get the genie back in the bottle. And I would go back to the 70s and give the following analogy. What's going on with the Fed right now is not Paul Volcker killing inflation. Paul Volcker stepped in after years of inadequate Fed efforts to control inflation. What we're seeing right now is the Fed at the beginning of the 1970s, when they had a chance to nip it in the bud and tighten and kill a modest inflation problem and keep that 2% kind of level for inflation. So the mistake is to not fight the inflation early and wait until it's really out of control. So we are in 1969, we're not in 1979. We need a tough Fed, but not a 1982 style collapse in the economy. We need a modest recession to get inflation under control.
So whatever you may believe about this country, ultimately the fate of the economy rests upon this guy. And if you can figure out where we are in 1969 or 1982, you can reliably estimate where things are going from here. As always, thank you guys for watching. Please make sure you hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed the content.